This is Duke University.
I grew up in the city. I lived there until I graduated from high school. This was very much Seattle before Microsoft, so it was a very different place than it is today. And it was, but also a very diverse place, racially, I would say. My parents, an interracial couple, came out to the West because where they met each other in St. Louis, it was still at that time in the late 50s illegal for them to be married, so they moved to a place where they could legally live together. We grew up, but it was still somewhat segregated. We grew up in the, maybe the first 6 or 7 years of my life, we lived in a black neighborhood, and then we integrated a previously all-white neighborhood, and so that was a challenging experience, even in the Pacific Northwest in the late 60s. I have one brother who's 2 years younger than I am, and my mother's white. She worked as a nurse. She worked nights so that she could be home with us. This was a time when it wasn't common for women to work. So she always felt that she had to be with us during the day to be a good mother. And then my father worked also in a hospital. He was a urological technician. So both my parents worked, and they wanted the best for us. They for the first 2 years of my schooling, I went to a private school. But they couldn't afford that for very long, and so I went to very good public schools. But they always tried to give us my brother and I were both adopted. I guess I didn't put that part in there, but so I was actually a year old when they adopted me. At that time, mixed race kids, they would only place them with mixed race families, and so it took them a long time to find a mixed race family for me. Because my parents had adopted us, they felt like having children and having a family was the most important thing to them. I was pretty young, so my memory of it is more, about how, how it affected me as a. I think that I was probably 6 or 7. And I guess the two things that I remember most are that there was one woman, when we moved, there was one woman on our street who didn't want us there, and she turned her garden hose on us as we would ride our bikes down the street, which just seemed, from a child's perspective, as just an absurd thing to do. It made no sense. But certainly it made us feel unwelcome and wary. And the other thing I remember is once that my brother, kids, we played with kids in the neighborhood. It's not like no one wanted us there, but there's some incident, and my brother got hurt by another kid, and my father went over to talk to the family, and I was very, very afraid because I thought they were going to hurt him. This was a time, late 60s, when there were riots in the streets in some communities, and there were marches. I don't think there were ever riots in Seattle. But I always had this great fear that because my family looked the way we did, with my brother looking more black than I did, that if we were ever in a neighborhood and a riot broke out, people wouldn't know that we were a family, and the wrong people, it felt like the wrong people would be trying to hurt us. So it was a very, as a child, and trying to live in those dynamics of very personal, your neighbors don't want you on your street kind of environment. It was frightening. In college, I faced a really new situation in that my racial identity had been a huge part of who I was growing up, and then when I went to college, people didn't, just by looking at me, didn't really know my background. Usually people, often people would say, you know, where are you from, which really was code for what's your racial background. So people knew I wasn't quite white, but they didn't really know what I was. And growing up, passing was just one thing I vowed I would never do. I remember my grandmother talking to me about how, my grandmother worked as a maid the whole time that I knew her growing up. And she used to say, when you grow up, you're going to see me walking down the street and you won't acknowledge me. Like passing would have been the worst denunciation of my family that I could have ever done. So to me, it was really important to never do that. And so when I went to college, Williams at that time had done this experiment where this was, you know, 1977. They admitted several African-American students from inner city schools in New York City to try to integrate the campus, I guess I would say. And there's a huge culture clash going on. And so you pretty much had to decide, were you going to sit with the black kids or were you going to sit with the white kids? And that kind of was a challenge. And I didn't know what a preppy was when I went to Williams College, which was a pretty huge mistake because there were plenty of them there. So there was a socioeconomic culture shock that I went through. I got involved with the Student Anti-Apartheid Coalition, and in my junior year we sat in at the administration building with a demand that the college divest its holdings in companies that do business in South Africa. And fortunately was able to do that and still have the respect of my professors, so I didn't have to, I didn't have any adverse academic consequences. But I would say the two most significant things I did while I was in college was negotiate this challenging cultural situation I found myself in without leaving. I so often thought, you know, I should go somewhere else that would be, where there'd be more diversity, it'd be easier to be who I am. But so to negotiate that environment and then, you know, find a cause that I felt deeply about and have a sense that I'd done something positive in that regard. The college didn't divest, but it did agree to not hold its money in banks that were operating in South Africa. So there was like this partial small victory that we could claim. And I learned a lot. Obviously, I learned a lot about movements and a little bit about organizing from that experience. For 10 years, I was basically, I feel like I was the utility player on the team. Whatever civil rights case came in, I was happy to work on it. A lot of what I did was police misconduct work, so representing, to a large degree, it was the families of individuals who'd been killed by police. Some of it was people who'd been injured in encounters where police used excessive force, and some of it was just false arrests, but mostly it was wrongful death cases involving the police killing, and almost without exception, people of color. I did a lot of voting rights work from the beginning. I also did employment discrimination, housing discrimination, some public accommodations cases, so really the whole gamut of civil rights cases. I also did criminal defense work, and I did, initially when I went there, I did domestic work as well, family law, you know, child custody, domestic violence. But I pretty quickly, like in the first 3 years, just did not want to do domestic law anymore, so I got out of that business. That was really a unique opportunity to do civil rights nationwide and to see how the Justice Department carries out its mandate to enforce civil rights laws. And it was a short period. I was only there 2.5 years. I was a Deputy Assistant Attorney General, which means I was a political appointee in what's called the front office. The part of the administration that's appointed by the President to carry out policy. I worked directly below Bill Lee, who was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, and I had several of the sections. With the Civil Rights Division has maybe 12 different sections, and I was responsible for 3 and at one point 4 of them. So I had both managerial and supervisory responsibility for, section chiefs who reported to me, but also policy responsibility. So charting out what they were supposed to achieve and accomplish in their work. There were major policy initiatives that I worked on. There wasn't so much litigation. I did get to argue one case in the 11th Circuit while I was in the Justice Department. But so it wasn't so much doing the day-to-day work, but really managing and directing policy. I had been in really 4 different types of civil rights practice. So I'd been in private practice, I'd been in a government entity, I'd been in a large national nonprofit, and I'd been at the Center for Civil Rights at UNC, which was a university-based project. And in each of those settings, I felt like I did not have all the resources that my clients needed. So, and I take very seriously the concept that we are general counsel for community-based organizations, and the role of a general counsel is to bring to their organization all of the different skills and resources that organization needs to thrive. And so what I think some of the core things that groups need are, in addition to legal advice and the capacity to access the legal system, they also need good research, social science research. They know what's happening to them, but documenting it is often very, very important. They need community organizing support skills. How do you sustain a community organizing effort over time? And then they need to be able to use the media. Whether it's print media, social media, that's an important way to tell their story, important way to influence decision makers. And I couldn't find a place where all 4 of those resources were made available to the clients. In national civil rights organizations, they do have a media person, but the media person is really more about promoting the organization itself, not necessarily the clients. So when I was at UNC, I just felt these constraints that were keeping me from being able to do what I felt needed to be done, most importantly for my clients. I had a 6-month plan. So I left UNC. I had a 6-month planning grant to put together from the Ford Foundation to put together the resources and the concepts and the body of work, I guess I would call it, that the organization would carry out, and that gave me the chance to really get things off the ground. I was working. I have a great founding board, young people with vision and enthusiasm, and predominantly people of color and people from impacted communities as well, working together to found the organization.
Produced by Duke University.